I'm reminded of a conversation I had years ago with a young conservative colleague of mine about racial differences, long before the bell curve was published and these arguments became fairly common. I suggested to him that there was evidence for hereditary differences between the races in IQ. And his immediate response, not unfriendly, was that I would be concerned where that argument could lead. I didn't pursue where he thought it might lead, partly because it was obvious enough, not to the abolition of affirmative action, not to the end of a great deal of egalitarian nonsense in social policy, but it would lead to slavery, to Jim Crow, to lynchings, to Auschwitz. As with most conservatives in recent years, all you need to do is ring the bell and they salivate the way the left has trained them. I could continue with these kinds of reactions to my efforts to write about white racial problems and consciousness for some time, but the point would be the same. Many whites, and while I can't prove it, I think the kind of responses I've received are fairly typical of what most American whites today believe and how they think about race and about being white. Many whites are deeply terrified by the very concept of race as it applies to whites. Their reaction to any frank discussion of the subject is what I have called before escape and evasion, on an intellectual level, but also on a deeper psychological level, to deny that race is real, to assert that even if it's real, it's not important, to assert that even if it's real and important, it's wrong, to assert that even if it's real and important and not wrong in itself, it could lead to terrible wrongs, and to share, consciously perhaps, but even more commonly, unconsciously, the assumption that whites, even though there is no such thing as whites, have done great evil throughout their history, and that history forbids them from any positive white racial identity or consciousness or even existence as a group. I'm reminded constantly in these replies and others of what James Burnham wrote in his book, Suicide of the West, in 1964, a book that was directed mainly at that time toward what Burnham identified as liberal responses to the erosion of Western, meaning American and European power throughout the world. As the European empires ebbed in the 1950s and 1960s, and communist and anti-Western power expanded, Burnham wrote, "The liberal reaction was one of accommodation, though the flaccid liberal response was not confined to foreign dangers." Toward the end of the book, in a passage that would deeply shock and offend most self-proclaimed conservatives today, Burnham offered this illustration of liberal rationalization of Western decline. At the beginning of September 1963, at a moment when the nation's constitutional and social fabric was being torn by generalized racial conflict that was posing issues impossible to settle and therefore certain to become graver and more dangerous over the coming years, the American Psychological Foundation held a large conference in Philadelphia. The New York Times singled out for a report the address in which Professor Gordon W. Allport of Harvard explained that the racial demonstrations in America are basically a sign of good national emotional health. On the whole, it is a wholesome and healthy movement. The Negroes, Professor Allport elaborated further, are running for home, a term he adapted from a goal gradient theory derived from the observation that an experimental subject speeds up when approaching the goal presented in a psychological test. It is easy to imagine, Burnham commented dryly, Professor Allport in late Roman days, explaining how the animals in the Colosseum are generally a playful lot, especially when running for home. Burnham concluded his book with an analogy that keeps coming to mind when discussing not the liberal responses to foreign communist conquests and Western decline, but the white responses to the realities, natural and social, of race. It is as if a man struck with a mortal disease were able to say and to believe, as the flush of the fever spread over his face, "Ah, the glow of health returning." As his flesh wasted away, "At least I am able to trim down that paunch the doctor always warned me about." As a finger dropped off with gangrene or leprosy, "Now I won't have that bothersome job of trimming those nails every week." Liberalism, Burnham concluded, permits Western civilization to be reconciled to dissolution, and this function, its formulas will enable it to serve right through to the very end, if matters turn out that way. For even if Western civilization is wholly vanquished or altogether collapses, we or our children will be able to see that ending by the light of the principles of liberalism, not as a final defeat, but as the transition to a new and higher order in which mankind as a whole joins in a universal civilization that has risen above the parochial distinctions and discriminations of the past. My purpose today is not to dissect the ideological and psychological construct that Burnham labeled liberalism, but to emphasize that whatever its label, what he was talking about is with us yet, a mentality now far more pervasive among whites than 1960s liberalism ever was, that reconciles the white race to dissolution and eventual extinction. It is, I want to emphasize, also much more a psychological phenomenon than an intellectual or philosophical one, although it makes use of intellectual and philosophical concepts to rationalize itself, concepts that often betray their irrational motivations simply by their transparent absurdity and incoherence. And because it is essentially psychological, and indeed a form of neurosis, it is a problem that we, by whom I mean people like us who read and even write for American Renaissance and similar publications, that we cannot adequately deal with on a rational and intellectual level. In other words, all the scientific arguments about IQ and DNA, all the facts about the reality of race as a force of nature or as a social and political force, all the statistics about black crime, black educational failures, black poverty, and the absence of significant black accomplishments over history, all that will avail us nothing because those are rational and intellectual appeals and are easily ignored or deflected by those who are unconsciously terrified by the realities to which they relentlessly point. I'm reminded of the children's poem about the little man upon the stair. The little man upon the stair, the little man who was not there. He wasn't there again today. I wish to hell he'd go away. Whites today spend an enormous amount of intellectual energy trying to persuade themselves that the little man of race that lurks upon the stair is not really there, and wishing that he would just go away. What we need to do is to explore more fully what it is that lies at the root of that delusion and of the mental block that prevents today's whites from confronting these realities, to discover why it is there and how it got there, and to find out how that block can be dissolved before the realities it hides destroys us. Thank you.